Here is something nobody tells you when you read about the kings of Israel. Out of the roughly 42 men and 1 woman who sat on the throne over the course of 500 years, the overwhelming majority of them are remembered by God with the exact same 5 words. He did evil in the sight of the Lord. Not some of them, most of them. Kings who built cities, kings who won wars, kings who expanded borders and filled treasuries. And when the divine verdict came down again and again and again, it was the same sentence: he did evil. And here is the part that should stop you cold. Some of these men started out incredibly well. Some of them began with humility, with prayer, with genuine devotion to God. One of them was literally called a man after God's own heart, and they still fell. So if you have ever looked at your own life and quietly wondered how a person who started out sincere, who genuinely loved God, could slowly drift into someone they swore they would never become, then the kings of Israel are not just ancient history. They are a mirror, because the story of these kings is not really a story about thrones and palaces and battles. It is the story of how power exposes what is already in a human heart. It is the story of how the same temptations that destroyed the most powerful men in the ancient world are the temptations sitting in your own chest right now. Today, I am going to walk you through every king who ruled over God's people. The ones who rose, the ones who ruled, and the ones who fell, which is almost all of them. And by the end of this, you will not just understand the history, you will understand the pattern. You will see the exact mechanism that took down king after king after king, and you will recognize that same mechanism operating quietly in your own life. So let us begin where it all started. Before there were any kings at all, Israel did not want one. God was their king. He led them out of Egypt. He gave them the law. He raised up judges to deliver them in times of crisis. But the people looked around at the nations surrounding them, and they wanted what those nations had. They wanted a man on a throne. They wanted to be like everybody else. So they came to the prophet Samuel and demanded a king, and God told Samuel something heartbreaking. 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 7. They have not rejected you, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. The entire monarchy of Israel began with a rejection of God's direct rule. The people traded the invisible king of the universe for a visible man they could see, and God in his sorrow gave them exactly what they asked for. Remember that. When you demand something God never wanted for you, He will sometimes let you have it, and the having of it will teach you why He said no. The first king was Saul, and on paper Saul was perfect. He was described as a choice and handsome man. From his shoulders upward, he was taller than any of the people. He looked exactly like what everyone imagined a king should look like. Tall, strong, impressive. The people got precisely the king they wanted. And in the beginning, Saul was even humble. When Samuel first told him he would be king, Saul hid among the baggage because he could not believe it. He was so unsure of himself that he physically hid. He hid among the baggage, unable to believe he had been chosen. But here's where the pattern begins. Saul could not wait on God. In 1 Samuel chapter 13, the Philistine army is gathering, and Saul is supposed to wait for Samuel to come and offer the sacrifice before battle. Samuel is late. The soldiers are getting scared and scattering. And Saul, panicking, decides to take matters into his own hands. He offers the sacrifice himself, a thing he had no authority to do. The moment he finishes, Samuel arrives, and Samuel tells him the words that doom his reign. 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 14. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought for himself a man after his own heart. Saul's sin was not a dramatic moral collapse. It was impatience. It was the inability to trust God's timing when the pressure was on. And if you have ever made a decision out of panic, a decision you knew was not yours to make, but the waiting felt unbearable and the fear felt overwhelming, then you already understand the first thing that destroys a king. It is not always some massive scandal. Sometimes it is just the refusal to wait. Saul's story spirals from there. He grows jealous. He grows paranoid. He watches a young man play the harp and sees a threat. He spends years hunting an innocent young man named David across the wilderness, and he ends his life on a battlefield wounded and defeated, falling on his own sword. That is king number 1. He looked the part. He had the height, the face, the army, and he fell because somewhere along the way he stopped trusting the God who put him there. But the next king would be different, or so everyone thought. David is the most famous king in the entire Bible, and for good reason. He is the shepherd boy who killed Goliath. He is the poet who wrote half the Psalms. He is the warrior who united the tribes, conquered Jerusalem, and built the kingdom into a genuine power. He is the man God himself called a man after my own heart. And here is what should absolutely terrify you. David fell too, not in a small way, in one of the most catastrophic moral collapses in all of Scripture. 2 Samuel chapter 11, it is spring, the time when kings go out to war. It is spring, the time when kings go out to war, but David is not at war. David is at home on his roof when he should have been leading his army. And from that roof he sees a woman bathing. Her name is Bathsheba. She is married to one of David's own loyal soldiers, a man named Uriah. And David, the man after God's own heart, sends for her, sleeps with her, and gets her pregnant. And then, to cover it up, he arranges to have her husband killed in battle. The shepherd who would not harm Saul even when Saul was hunting him, now murders one of his most faithful men to hide his own sin. Watch the pattern. David did not fall because he was weak. He fell at the height of his power. David did not fall because he was weak. He fell at the height of his power. He fell when he had everything. He fell in a season of ease, when he had stopped doing the work, when he was idle on a rooftop instead of out in the field where he belonged. You know this. You know how the most dangerous season of your life is not the season of struggle. It is the season right after the victory, when you think you are finally safe. But here is what makes David different from almost every other king on this list. And that is the second thing that destroys a king. It is not failure, it is comfort. The moment you can finally relax and you let your guard down. When the prophet Nathan confronted him, David did not make excuses. He did not have Nathan killed. He broke. He fell on his face and wrote Psalm chapter 51, "Against you only have I sinned. Create in me a clean heart, O God." The difference between a king who survives his fall and a king who is destroyed by it is not whether he sins. It is what he does in the moment he gets caught. David fell as hard as any king ever fell, but he repented harder than any king ever repented. And that single difference, the willingness to be broken before God instead of defending himself, is the reason God still kept his promise to David's line. Remember that. We will come back to it, because the next king had more wisdom than any human being who ever lived, and it still was not enough. Solomon was David's son, and when he became king, God appeared to him in a dream and offered him anything he wanted, anything. 1 Kings chapter 3. Solomon could have asked for anything. Solomon could have asked for wealth, for long life, for the death of his enemies. Instead, he asked for wisdom to govern God's people well. And God was so pleased that he gave Solomon not just unmatched wisdom, but also the wealth and honor he did not ask for. Solomon built the temple, the most magnificent structure in Israel's history. He wrote thousands of proverbs. Kings and queens traveled from the ends of the earth just to hear him speak. The kingdom reached its absolute peak under his reign. Gold was so common in Jerusalem that silver was considered worthless. And then the wisest man who ever lived did the stupidest thing imaginable. 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 4. For it was so when Solomon was old that his wives turned his heart after other gods. And his heart was not loyal to the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines, many of them from foreign nations that worshipped other gods. And one compromise at a time, one accommodation at a time, one let me just keep the peace decision at a time. The wisest man in history built altars to false gods on the hills around Jerusalem. He did not abandon God in a single dramatic moment. He drifted slowly through 1,000 small surrenders. And that is the third thing that destroys a king. It is not one big decision. It is the slow accumulation of small ones. You know this pattern. You did not become distant from God in a single afternoon. It happened the way it always happens. One skipped prayer, one justified compromise, one small thing you told yourself did not matter, and Solomon, with all his wisdom, proved that you can know exactly what is right and still slowly walk away from it. Here is the tragedy that sets up everything else. Because of Solomon's idolatry, God declared that the kingdom would be torn in two, not in Solomon's lifetime for David's sake, but in his son's. If this is hitting something in you, if you are starting to see your own life in these men, take a second right now to subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because what comes next is the part of the story almost nobody ever explains, and it is where the pattern goes from tragic to absolutely staggering. Let us keep going. When Solomon died, his son Rehoboam took the throne, and in his very first act as king, Rehoboam made the single dumbest political decision in Israel's history. The older, wiser advisors told him to serve the people, and they would serve him forever. The young hotheads he grew up with told him to crush them, and Rehoboam, wanting to look strong, chose the young men. The people came to him and asked him to lighten the heavy taxes and forced labor his father had imposed. The older, wiser advisers told him to serve the people, and they would serve him forever. 1 Kings chapter 12 verse 11. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scourges. And in that instant, the kingdom split in two. 10 tribes in the north broke away and formed their own nation, which kept the name Israel. 2 tribes in the south stayed loyal to David's line, and that kingdom became known as Judah. From this point forward, there are 2 separate lines of kings, 2 separate thrones, 2 separate stories, and I want you to see the difference between them, because it reveals one of the most important truths in the entire Bible. The northern kingdom, Israel, had 19 kings over about 200 years, and here is the staggering part. Every single one of them was evil, not most, all of them. 19 out of 19. There was not one good king in the entire history of the northern kingdom. It started with the very first one. Jeroboam, the man who led the rebellion, was terrified that if his people kept traveling south to Jerusalem to worship, they would eventually return their loyalty to the king of Judah. So he did something catastrophic. He set up 2 golden calves, one in the north and one in the south of his territory. 1 Kings chapter 12 verse 28. It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, which brought you up from the land of Egypt. He invented a counterfeit religion for political convenience, and every king who followed him in the north walked in the sins of Jeroboam. That phrase becomes a refrain, repeated over and over. He walked in the way of Jeroboam. The pattern was set by the first king and inherited by every king after him. And every king who followed him in the north walked in the sins of Jeroboam. He walked in the way of Jeroboam, and in his sin by which he had made Israel sin. And the northern kings did not just inherit the sin, they escalated it. There was Nadab, who reigned 2 years and was assassinated. There was Baasha, who seized the throne by murdering the entire family of the previous king. There was Elah, who was killed by his own servant Zimri while he was drunk. There was Zimri, who reigned a grand total of 7 days before he burned the palace down around himself rather than be captured. There was Omri, a militarily impressive king who was, in God's eyes, worse than everyone before him. And then there was Omri's son, the most infamous king in the entire northern kingdom. There was Ahab. Ahab married a foreign princess named Jezebel, and together they made Baal worship the official religion of the nation. They murdered the prophets of God. They stole land and killed an innocent man named Naboth just to take his vineyard. 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 33 says it plainly. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him. This is the king God raised up the prophet Elijah to confront. This is the showdown on Mount Carmel, where Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal, and called down fire from heaven. And even after seeing that, Ahab did not truly repent. He died in battle exactly as the prophets said he would, his blood running into the bottom of his chariot. After Ahab came Jehu, a violent military commander who wiped out the entire house of Ahab in a bloody purge. Jehu destroyed Baal worship, and for that God commended him. After Ahab came his sons, and then a violent military commander named Jehu, who wiped out the entire house of Ahab in a bloody purge. Jehu destroyed Baal worship, and for that God commended him. But even Jehu would not give up the golden calves of Jeroboam. Even the man who cleaned house kept the original sin. After Jehu came a string of kings, some lasting decades, some lasting months, almost all dying violently. Assassination after assassination. Menahem, who was so brutal he ripped open pregnant women in the cities that resisted him. Jehoahaz, Jehoash, Jeroboam II, who actually expanded the kingdom and brought prosperity, but did evil in the eyes of the Lord. Zechariah, murdered after 6 months. Shallum, murdered after 1 month. Menahem, who was so brutal he ripped open pregnant women in the cities that resisted him. Pekahiah, assassinated. Pekah, assassinated. And finally Hoshea, the last king of the north. And here is where the pattern reaches its terrible conclusion, because God does not stay silent forever. For 200 years he sent prophet after prophet to the northern kingdom. Elijah, Elisha, Amos, Hosea. For 200 years God sent prophet after prophet to the northern kingdom. Elijah, Elisha, Amos, Hosea, warning after warning after warning. And the kings ignored every single one. So in 722 BC, God allowed the Assyrian Empire, the most brutal military machine the ancient world had ever seen, to sweep down and destroy the northern kingdom completely. 2 Kings chapter 17 verse 23. So Israel was carried away from their own land to Assyria, as it is to this day. So Israel was carried away from their own land to Assyria, as it is to this day. The 10 northern tribes were scattered, deported, and absorbed into the empire. They never returned. They are remembered to this day as the 10 lost tribes. An entire nation gone, because 19 kings in a row refused to turn back. And I need you to feel the weight of that before we move on. God is patient. He was unbelievably patient. There comes a point where a hardened heart has refused so many times that the warnings stop, and the consequences begin. That is the most sobering truth in the story of the northern kings. But the southern kingdom was different, or at least it had a chance to be. God is patient. God is unbelievably, almost incomprehensibly patient. He sent warning after warning for 200 years. But patience is not the same thing as permanence. The southern kingdom, Judah, had 20 kings over about 350 years. And unlike the north, not all of them were evil. Some of them brought real revival. Unlike the north, not all of them were evil. Some of them were genuinely good. Some of them brought real revival. And that difference is the whole point. Judah had something the north did not. Judah had the line of David, and God had made a promise. So even when Judah's kings failed, God kept the dynasty alive for the sake of his promise. Let me show you the good ones, because they are the ones who reveal what was actually possible. Judah had the line of David, and God had made a promise to David that his lamp would never be extinguished. There was Asa, who removed idols and led the nation back to God, even removing his own grandmother from her position because she had made an idol. There was Jehoshaphat, who sent teachers throughout the land to instruct the people in the law of God, who stood before the nation when an overwhelming army approached and prayed with complete vulnerability. There was Jehoshaphat, who, when faced with an overwhelming army, stood before the entire nation and prayed. 2 Chronicles chapter 20 verse 12, "We have no power against this great multitude, but our eyes are upon you." And God delivered them, without them lifting a sword. There was Joash, who repaired the temple, though he tragically fell away at the end of his life after the priest who mentored him died. When his mentor was gone, so was his faith. There was Hezekiah, one of the greatest kings of Judah, who tore down the high places and trusted God against the same Assyrian army that had destroyed the north. When the Assyrian general Sennacherib sent a letter mocking God and demanding surrender, Hezekiah took the letter into the temple and spread it before the Lord. And that night, the angel of the Lord struck down 185,000 Assyrian soldiers. And when morning came, Sennacherib broke camp and returned to Nineveh. Jerusalem was saved. And there was Josiah, who became king at 8 years old, and who, when a lost copy of God's law was discovered in the temple during renovations, tore his robes in grief over how far the nation had drifted. 2 Kings chapter 23 verse 25, "Now before him there was no king like him, who turned to the Lord with all his heart, with all his soul, and with all his might. But for every good king in Judah, there were others who undid everything. There was Jehoram, who murdered all his own brothers to secure his throne. There was Ahaz, who sacrificed his own children in fire to a foreign god, and shut the doors of the temple. And there was the most chilling king of all, Manasseh, the son of the godly Hezekiah. Manasseh reigned 55 years, longer than any other king of Judah, and he was the most wicked. He rebuilt the high places his father had destroyed. He practiced witchcraft. He set up idols inside the temple of God itself, and he sacrificed his own sons in the fire. 2 Kings chapter 21 says he shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from one end to the other. 2 Kings chapter 21 verse 16 says he shed so much innocent blood that he filled Jerusalem from one end to the other. And yet here is the thing about Manasseh that almost nobody knows. In 2 Chronicles chapter 33, after Manasseh was captured by the Assyrians and dragged away in chains with a hook in his nose, in the depths of his suffering, this most wicked king humbled himself greatly before God and prayed. And God unbelievably heard him, restored him, and brought him back. Even the worst king in Judah's history was not beyond the reach of God's mercy when he finally broke. Hold on to that, because it matters more than almost anything else in this entire story, even Manasseh, even him. But Manasseh's repentance came too late to save the nation. After the great reformer Josiah died in battle, the final kings of Judah came in rapid succession, each one worse than the last. Jehoahaz, who reigned 3 months before Egypt carried him off. Jehoiakim, who burned the words of the prophet Jeremiah in a fire, cutting them off column by column with a knife as they were read to him. Jehoiakim, who reigned 3 months before being carried off to Babylon. And finally Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, who rebelled against Babylon, despite the prophet Jeremiah pleading with him not to. So in 586 BC, the Babylonian army under Nebuchadnezzar broke through the walls of Jerusalem. They burned the temple that Solomon had built. They tore down the walls of the city, and they captured Zedekiah as he tried to flee. The last thing Zedekiah ever saw before they put out his eyes was the execution of his own sons. 2 Kings chapter 25 verse 7. Then they killed the sons of Zedekiah before his eyes, put out the eyes of Zedekiah, bound him with bronze fetters, and took him to Babylon. The line of kings was over. The temple was rubble. The people were in chains, marching toward exile. The kingdom that began when the people rejected God as their king ended in fire and blindness and slavery. That is how the story of the kings of Israel ends, not with a triumph, with a funeral. So look at where this leaves us. Saul fell because he could not wait. David fell at the height of his comfort. Solomon fell through 1,000 small compromises. Saul fell because he could not wait. David fell at the height of his comfort. Solomon fell through 1,000 small compromises. The kings of Israel are not a history lesson. They are an X-ray. They show you exactly what happens to a human being who is given power and left to his own heart. And the terrifying thing, the thing you cannot unsee now, is that the same 3 forces that destroyed those kings are operating in your life right at this moment. 19 kings of the north fell because they inherited a sin and refused to release it, and the kings of Judah, even the good ones, mostly could not hold the line. And you are sitting there watching all of this, and maybe a part of you is thinking, what does any of this have to do with me? I am not a king. I do not have a throne. But here is the truth that should land on you right now. You have a throne. The throne is your own heart, and every single day you decide who sits on it. The impatience that destroyed Saul, the inability to wait on God when the pressure is on, you feel it. The comfort that destroyed David, the way your guard goes down the moment you finally feel safe, the way the sin you would have resisted in a season of struggle you surrender to in a season of ease, you know it. And the slow drift that destroyed Solomon, the 1,000 small compromises that you tell yourself do not matter, that are quietly building altars to other gods on the hills of your own life. You recognize it. That weight you carry, that quiet awareness late at night that you are not who you used to be, that you started out sincere and somewhere along the way you drifted. That is not random. That is the oldest pattern in the Bible. And if the story ended there, it would be the most hopeless story ever told. But it does not end there, because there is one more thing the kings of Israel were pointing to the entire time, and if you miss it, you miss everything. Every one of these kings failed, every single one, even the best of them, even the man after God's own heart. The whole monarchy was a 500-year-long demonstration that humanity needed a different kind of king, a king no human being could be. Every one of these kings failed, every single one, even the best of them, and that failure was not an accident, it was the point. For 500 years God was showing his people that no human king, no matter how handsome, how wise, how devoted, can carry the weight of a throne without eventually falling. A king who would not fall. A king who would not abuse his power but would lay it down. A king who, instead of murdering an innocent man to save himself like David did, would let himself be murdered to save the guilty. And he came. He came from the line of David, exactly as God promised. He was born in the city of David. And when Pilate asked him if he was the king of the Jews, he did not deny it. They nailed a sign above his head on the cross, written in 3 languages, that read, "This is the king." The kings of Israel all fell because they sat on a throne they were never strong enough to hold. Jesus took the throne by climbing onto a cross. And he is the only king in the history of the world who never, not once, did evil in the sight of the Lord. So here's what I want you to do, right now, before you click away. Think about the throne of your own heart. Think about which of those 3 forces is operating in you most powerfully right now. Because this is the difference between watching a video and actually changing. Think about which of those 3 forces is operating in you most powerfully right now. The impatience, the comfort, the slow drift. You already know which one it is. You felt it land while I was talking. The same God who showed Manasseh, the most wicked king in Judah's history, that he was not beyond mercy when he finally broke. That same God is waiting for you to break too, not to crush you, to heal you. And here is the good news the kings of Israel could not fully see, but you can. The same God who showed Manasseh that he was not beyond mercy, that same God is waiting for you. The difference between David, who survived his fall, and Saul, who was destroyed by his, was never the size of the sin. It was whether they were willing to be broken before God instead of defending themselves. So break, right now, stop defending, stop drifting, and come home to the only King who will never let you down. Not as a phrase, but as a decision you are making today, right now, in this moment. And subscribe, because the next thing we walk through is going to go even deeper. Comment below, Jesus be the King of my heart. Subscribe so you do not miss what comes next. Let me pray for you before you go. Father, for everyone watching this, for the ones who are